Welcome to this plenary discussion, The Invisible Wave, Catalysing a Global Moment to Address Marine Chemical Pollution. Having just set out the findings of The Invisible Wave, Economist Impact's recent released report on marine chemical pollution for our Back to Blue initiative, the intention of this discussion is both to give our audience a sense of the threat, the problem briefly, but then particularly to ask how this global moment, notably with the recent deliberations on pollution at the United Nations Environment Assembly, how this particular moment can be seized. What will it take? What is possible in policy terms through market-based actions, awareness raising, and through engaging relevant stakeholders to catalyze and accelerate progress? So before I introduce our panelists, let me thank them first for their contributions to The Invisible Wave, to the report. The report is certainly immeasurably richer and improved by your expertise. Though, of course, the usual caveats apply. We alone are responsible for the content and perspectives and whatever shortcomings there may be. But a warm thank you to all for your participation and contributions to the report. And let me introduce then our panelists, Elsie Sunderland, the Gordon Mackay Professor of Environmental Chemistry at Harvard University. Welcome, Elsie. And Sophie Bakker, who's Executive Director of ChemSec, the International Chemical Secretariat, which advocates for stricter controls on chemicals. And Joel Tickner, Executive Director of Green Chemistry and Commerce Council, a business-to-business organization advocating the adoption of green chemicals. And Dennis Fritsch, Sustainable Blue Finance Lead at the United Nations Environment Programme. Welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining us. So let's begin, shall we, with a brief look at some of the challenges that are faced in this complex area of marine chemical pollution. And one of the challenges that we faced in putting our report together has been that the problem of marine chemical pollution is literally invisible and indeed metaphorically invisible too, in the sense that it is not especially well understood. I wonder if you'd start us off, Elsie Sunderland, by outlining what is known about the scope and scale of the problem and why you feel it's not really very well understood.
Sure. Thanks so much, Charles, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel today. As you've already alluded to, when we talk about the invisible wave of chemical pollution, one of the key terms there is invisible. So as humans, we're trained to perceive, so see, smell, sense our problems around us. And chemical pollutants, although they're pervasive now in the global environment, are not something you can see and detect in this way. So we lack those visual sensory clues. As chemists, we're able to actually go out and detect a whole soup of synthetic organic compounds and heavy metals that have been enriched in the environment or deliberately produced and are now detected in even the most remote ecosystems, so in the Arctic and in the Antarctic. And I think, one of the challenges that we face here is, we're in a situation where sometimes we detect high levels in the marine environment. We're seeing negative impacts on ecosystems, on wildlife health, with implications for human health. But we're not at a catastrophic, exposure level. And so if we reached a catastrophic exposure level, you would see, die-offs and something visible that we could perceive. And instead what we have is this rising global background. So as a toxicologist, you would talk about acute versus chronic exposures. So we have chronic low-level exposures to these compounds for our wildlife, for human populations that consume marine foods. And we really need to focus on those solutions to prevent this from becoming a catastrophic problem. I will add one thing, which is, when we're thinking about the health effects of those chronic exposures, the endpoints that we think about are things like neurotoxicity, both for marine mammals and wildlife and humans, impacts on immune health, and impacts on reproductive and endocrine health. And those, if you think about them, are also invisible. So typically when we think about chemical pollution, if we think about some of the catastrophes that have happened with human populations in the past, you might think of something like the thalidomide disaster, so where you could see visible birth defects. So if we can see that in animals, again, it becomes a visible problem. So I'll stop there, but I think you hit it exactly on the head when you said the invisible wave. So I'm pleased to talk about solutions today.
So just very briefly, I wanted to touch on this question of ecosystem functioning, because we do talk a little bit about biota and we talk about what the impact on animals and living creatures might be of this. And we, as you say, we don't have a particularly clear picture of that. But actually, we don't have a clear picture at all of the potential impact on chemicals on ecosystems, on broader systems, and on their functioning, do we?
I think you're right. We don't have a comprehensive global sense of the problem at this point. We know it's a globally pervasive problem. And we know for some ecosystems, this is already a catastrophic problem. So we have these two different scales that we have to think about. And I think in terms of impacts on ecosystem health, you're absolutely right. Those can be cascading impacts. You can affect the reproduction and the fertility of marine organisms. We can talk about different types of chemical pollution. If we include nutrient pollution in that picture, then you can affect the whole ability of that ecosystem to function. And I think what's really challenging is we're talking about very different spatial scales that interact. And so identifying the magnitude and severity and timescales of that problem is challenging. Although I would say we do have evidence that there is a problem now and that there are definitive impacts on ecosystem functioning and on human and wildlife populations globally.
Thank you. So that, I think, nicely sets the scene for us. And let me just move straight, if I can, to Anne-Sophie Bakker and to one of our findings that, perhaps unsurprisingly, I think, that the policy and regulatory landscape with, sort of numerous international treaties, domestic legislation, laws, regulations designed to tackle pollution and, in some instances, marine chemical pollution, that body of that complex spaghetti of laws is very complex, as I said, but also very fragmented. And ultimately, as we say in the report, ineffective. Why has it been so difficult to make progress, do you think, around legislation, regulation, and policy?
I think there are two main reasons. One is that we lack information. In the most regions in the world, it's like the regulators have to really prove the evidence, what is the problem. And it's difficult to always link that exactly to which chemicals and to see the consequences out of it. So for most regions, the setup of the legislation are difficult because it puts too much evidence on the authorities to bring forward a ban, bring forward actions. I think that's one of the main reasons, actually globally. And the second one I would say is also there are very strong forces against it. If you do produce a certain chemical in a plant, you can't just swift that plant and produce something else. It's very difficult. So you need to, if you build a plant, you need to have, they want, of course, to get money out of it. So therefore, it's difficult to just close down something. Therefore, there are so strong forces to not move in certain directions. And we also say there are so many companies, if they dare to go the steps, that they do changes and do transform their products to less hazardous chemicals, there are no market advantages today in hardly any region in the world that you get a market advantage, apart from a few consumers that are aware of it and want to buy it. But the other ones, they know what they said, I took the cost extra as a company to change, but what did I get of it? I didn't get any market benefits. I think these two problems, that the too much workload, evidence on the authorities, political decision makers, and the resistance within business, because they have nothing really to gain with changing.
So part of that problem is about a technical capacity and an investment in the technical capacity to understand, is it, the challenges, the toxicity, the difficulties that chemicals pose?
Yeah, I think the setup, how you do legislations quite often is the problem, that you demand so much information from the authorities to know. It's easy if we need to say like this, we need to start regulate chemicals on group level, large groups, and say all these chemicals, or at least majority of them, have big problems. So let us regulate all of them instead of going individual from each chemical after each other, taking ages before we can regulate them. And then I think in addition, you need to transition in the mindset. Okay, we have the aims. We really want to get out of these chemicals. Then you can discuss the way, how to go there for the industry. What does industry need to get there? But let's stick to the aims. We have to stop the pollution from the oceans, from the humans, from everyone. And then we have to think, okay, there we're going, but how should we go there? So let us discuss the aims, the way instead of the goals.
Okay, well, let me just pick up on a point that you raised, Anne-Sophie, and then come put that to Joel Tickner if I can, and that is this question of the forces against rectifying the challenge, or at least addressing some of the externalities that are caused by the chemicals industry. And just sort of understand your own thoughts about the roles and responsibilities of industry here to address those externalities, and indeed whether or not industry is in a good position to do that, because at the moment it's dug itself into a pretty big hole, hasn't it? I mean, industry is creating these externalities. It's sprawling. It's very capital intensive, etc. It's difficult to change, isn't it?
Well, I think it's bigger than just the chemical industry, right? It's the chemical industry and the whole value chain of companies along the way that turn those chemistries into products, and the consumption patterns and the consumers that use those materials. So it's a whole system problem. I mean, we have to start with the fact that we built most of our chemistry around a small number of platform chemicals, and those chemicals are used to make other chemicals. So this is what one industry expert has called chemical or molecular monoculture. We're starting with a small number of chemicals and then iterating to make a lot of other chemicals. Those are based primarily on fossil fuel feedstocks. They date back to the 1930s to 50s to 60s. So, innovation has been locked out, right? Only iterative innovation are we allowed to do at this point because we built the system a certain way. And the system grew up very quickly and very successfully, right? The products we have today were built on a system that grew in a period of 30 years because of significant investment, public-private partnerships, government interventions. It was an industrial revolution. The only thing that we failed to do in that industrial revolution is think about health, safety, and environment. So coming back now, we have to rethink that system. But it isn't just the chemical industry, it's the whole value chain of products and production and consumption that feed from there. So it is a systems problem. And the challenge is, as Anne-Sophie was mentioning, when you've capitalized, when you've built your infrastructure and your assets around a certain type of chemistry, it's very hard to rethink that, right? Because you've spent hundreds of millions of dollars building a certain material that then is embedded in a complex global supply chain. And there's these forces against, right, headwinds against change that we need to really rethink. So, yes, can we make marginal success gains in switching chemistry, for example, bio-based chemicals or green chemistry? We can do that, but we have to then come back to the whole global production system that we have created and the externalities of that system. And many of those externalities were caused by production choices, right? We want low-cost manufacture in other countries, so we put it there, which limits the amount of information in that value chain versus if you have your whole production system in a single country or a single region. So, these are global economic and systems challenges that require a global system solution. And that's, as Elsie was saying, we can't wait until we have the proof of harm, because then it's going to be too late. We have that accumulating evidence that harm is happening. And, as a health scientist, by the time we wait for that harm, it's too late. So really these, as you've mentioned, Charles, these global tipping points are here. the Code Red for Humanity from the IPCC, the boundaries of chemical pollution, and these are setting a wake-up call for change at this point.
Thank you, Joel. And I think that sort of failing to act now is a risk too far thought is a really important one for us to sort of remind ourselves through this conversation that whilst we don't have all the evidence in front of us, we do in fact have plenty of potential for action. And coming on to that, let me just come to you, Dennis, and just ask very simply, do you think financial institutions and investors are A, aware of the risks associated with chemical pollution and marine chemical pollution, and B, do you think they're aware of the very broad systemic changes that are needed, including their changes, in order to address this?
Thanks, Charles, and also I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me. Yeah, that's a very good question. I think from a financial institution standpoint, the whole climate agenda, and also now recently talking about biodiversity, has really gone up the agenda of financial institutions. So the awareness is slowly increasing, although I would say that especially when it comes to ocean-linked activities, there is a lot of interest, but not necessarily so much awareness and expertise about what actually needs to be done. And we all know that a healthy ocean is key for a thriving economy and is a main ally in trying to fix the climate, biodiversity, and pollution crises. And we all, I think, and I include financial institutions in that, is that business as usual for all of these topics is no longer an option. And we try to educate financial institutions on the concept of the sustainable blue economy, which essentially recognizes that leverage that financial institutions have as providers of capital to shift approaches to ocean resources and ocean-linked sectors around and at pace. Again, I would say momentum is growing. There is a recognition that collectively financial institutions have an enormous impact on ocean health across climate, biodiversity, and pollution considerations. And that slowly but surely that building resilience and kind of long-term stability into these activities offers an opportunity in reducing risk, but also profitability in the long term. But I would say, especially on the topic of marine chemical pollution, we're not quite there yet. On plastics, I would say yes, there is growing awareness on that plastics is an issue. And there's a lot of excitement, actually, especially among the investor community, to tackle that problem. But when we talk about things like agricultural runoff, that is still in its infancy, I would say. So certainly more awareness raising and education needed.
And I assume we are at the United Nations Environment Assembly. One of the things that's been discussed is this question of a global treaty on plastics. And that framework, I think, will offer both investors, financial institutions, and indeed many others a way of moving forward that provides some certainty for them, I think, in a broad environment, assuming that treaty eventually comes to pass. And I suppose I would ask the same question in relation to chemical pollution. Is there something similar that might be done in the chemical sphere? Is there a global treaty, for example, to tackle marine chemical pollution? Would that be something that might be worthwhile, or is that too specific? Or indeed, as a number of people have suggested, is there an intergovernmental science policy body that might be created in order to draw together the threads globally of the chemical and waste challenge? And I put this to everybody. Let me come to Elsie and then back to you again, Dennis, and to Anne, Sophie. Is there a need now to join all of this up globally in one way or another? Elsie.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. I think there's a growing call among scientists to have this global body on chemicals and waste. And then we do have global conventions in place for certain pollutants. We have the Stockholm Convention, we have the Minamata Convention for mercury. And what we've seen is very much, some of the issues that Anna Sophie raised in terms of the burden of information to add new chemicals to, say, the Stockholm Convention is very high. So we're currently not keeping pace with the innovation in chemistry. I thought Joel's comments were very interesting, talking about those base chemicals, but those base chemicals then translate into many, many diverse chemical structures that we release to the environment, and as chemists are always chasing and trying to find. So we're not able to keep up with the problem. I would put out there that I don't think we're able to keep up with the problem or find the rigor of solutions that we need with the existing global bodies and treaties that we have in place. And I'd love to just stop there and hear from others about their ideas of, what else could we do, or could we transform those agreements, to be more effective or change the way chemicals are added. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that thought that we don't seem to be able to keep up with the problem is a really, really important one. And Sophie, I mean, I know that, clearly that's a challenge, both in the European Union, where you do a lot of your work, but also globally. What do you think is a potential solution to join up the various threads of this complex problem?
I mean, it's great to have international bodies and deal with it, but as you said, it goes too slowly. We would never manage to solve the problems with it. But what I think would very make sense is to set up a science panel about it and get some scenarios that could be easy to communicate. If we go on like this, what does it mean for the oceans? Okay, if we're doing these and these actions, what will it mean for the oceans? And then a third scenario, the realistic one that we really need to go. Okay, if we do these and these and these actions, then we are there where we would like to go, the vision, the healthy oceans. I think that would make very much sense to set up such a panel to come to these scientific solutions and make them easy to communicate so that everyone can understand them, similar to what has been done with the climate issue. But in addition to that, of course, we have to tackle regional. It's not possible with international bodies. It goes too slowly. We need the regions to push forward. I work very much in the European Union, and I can say that many of the legislations that take place in the European Union, they have global impacts. Because if we ban certain chemicals in Europe, the Americans don't want the same in their cosmetics or household products, nor the other ones in the rest of the world. So it is also important to allow and push forward different regions, how they could go ahead. And I think from Europe, what could be used globally is a few things. One is, and what I mentioned before, is the need to tackle chemicals on group level. And we need to have a precautionary approach. We can't know everything, but we have to act. We have enough evidence to know what to do. And transparency. We need to know much, much more who is producing what, which chemicals, how is it going along the supply chain. We talk to very many companies down the supply chains, and they don't get the information. They say, we would like to go information. We don't want to sell these jackets with PFAS, but I don't have the information. I say, what else could I do? So we, for example, made a call for PFAS and among companies that they could join and say, okay, please regulate them as a group. Then we will find alternatives that are safer. So now around 70 companies have joined and said, okay, come on, European Commission, ban the whole group of them. Then there will come up alternatives. Then the chemical industry will find easily research and come up with safer alternatives. So I think there's certain things that we need to build on it. It's transparency, group of chemicals, and precaution.
And you mentioned that both precautionary principles are essential, and unfortunately, that isn't necessarily the case in other legislative environments, such as the United States, where litigation tends to be the way forward. And I guess that there needs to be a wholesale disclosure, really, of the kind of chemicals that have been used in different products. And that is part of what's happening in the European Union, at least to some degree. The question, I suppose, is how do you get... And Sophie?
I mean, it's difficult to go global level, but I can say right now, it's 1 year ago they decided that all companies have to disclose information if the products contain 0.1% of very hazardous chemicals. And there are already 7 million articles that are registered within 1 year. And these are the companies that are responsible and have done their work really to report these chemicals, these products. But imagine how many else companies don't even know what they have in their products. So this is a great step, but it just illustrates almost the problem. 7 million products containing very nasty chemicals causing cancer, never breaking down. But it's a step, and I think more steps like that are absolutely needed.
Joel, can I just ask you to comment on that as well? Because I think clearly on the regulatory side, the kind of interventions that Anne-Sophie is suggesting, that there needs to be a precautionary principle applied, that potentially harmful chemicals need to be treated first, possibly mandatory disclosure. What do you think is going to make sense and work on the regulatory side?
Right. I mean, this is a big challenge, right? So, going back to the global level, the science policy interface for chemicals, I think that is a brilliant idea. We know that the science of climate really evolved and took a center stage at a global level, in part due to a global scientific consensus of the problem. The challenge here is we don't want to get stuck in the problem. We did that for too long with climate change, debating how bad it is and didn't move to solutions, right? So that science policy interface has to have a solution science agenda to it, which is linking the science of the problems with how to understand those problems so we can design better solutions. Actually, the Royal Society of Chemistry is trying to bring those together with green chemistry and the science of problems. We need to think bigger, right? In the US regulatory system under our Toxic Substances Control Act, we'll be here for several hundred years before we tackle the chemical universe. So we need something bigger and more aggressive, but I think it needs to identify, understand where those chemicals are, right? The chemical transparency, prioritize those that are of highest concern for transition, and then link that to a significant R&D, innovation, commercialization, and scale effort to bring those alternative chemistries into the marketplace, right? We can get rid of bad all we want, but if we don't have good to replace it, we're going to be stuck in the same problems. We'll iterate on the same bad again because we don't have a way out, right? If I'm a chemist and I can't use one chemical, I'm going to find the next best thing that works, and it's going to be something very similar. So that's why Anne-Sophie was mentioning we need to look at this at a class level, at a functional level. It turns out that there are tens of thousands of chemicals, but there are only about 150 chemical functions in the literature. And we can start looking at those functions, those services chemicals provide, and understand how we achieve those functions through either chemical means, product redesign or material changes, or even product service changes, right? We can move from bisphenol A in cash register receipts to electronic receipts. It's the same issue. We want a thermal developer, so we have a documentation of a transaction. So we need to think about product redesign in this as well, because that is pretty central to why we use certain chemicals. They're incorporated into products, into materials, into products. So this is, again, problems linked to solutions is going to be very key to this at a global level. The good news is that we built this system in a 30-year period with massive investment, intervention, and supply chain collaboration, which means we can build it very differently if we so choose to do it. I'm convinced and hopeful that we can think about chemistry very differently and the types of products and systems we incorporate chemistry into. One of my favorite examples of quick global action is the Montreal Protocol, right? The science was there for a while, but really when Roland and Mario Molina had their famous paper, the world acted in a decade to address chlorofluorocarbons, and not only linked to getting rid of bad, but put in a whole set of systems to identify alternatives to chlorofluorocarbons. And we made some mistakes in that, HCFC or HFCs, but we quickly acted on those too. So, which means that we can actually move globally when we choose to do that.
So we don't want a system that bogs us down, but we do, in fact, want a science policy interface that, despite its probable slowness, is there in the background to help us interpret some of the really important things we need to interpret. But we do need a more action-oriented framework, it seems to me, to be able to try and move other things forward. And Elsie, can I come to you in just 1 second? But I just want to ask Dennis on that point. Clearly, one of the things that will be needed is some sort of taxonomy, some sort of framework for ESG and for investors and financial institutions around this. And we are beginning to see movement around the new task force on nature-based financial disclosure. Will this be the way forward, do you think? If we build the kind of ESG guidance that's needed for chemicals, will companies and will financial institutions take notice?
Yeah, I think what I first want to say is very, very positively affected by the very pragmatic suggestions of the co-panelists here. Very much appreciate the focus on solutions and also the urge to move swiftly. I think from a financial institution point of view, and that from our end usually means banks, insurers, investors, to have a transparent and relatively secure enabling environment for private capital to flow into any type of activity, and nature positive, for example, that's crucial. So to have regulation, common standards to set the guardrails for such finance to flow into these actions, positive actions, is really crucial. And therefore, I think I'm very much in support of having guidelines. Of course, we at the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative, we have a set of principles, the Sustainable Blue Economy Finance principles, that are very much geared at a high level look at SDG 14, life below water. So they take into account things like the precautionary principle. They take into account science-based decision-making. They take into account channeling investments into innovative new solutions, and they can really work as a high-level framework that is focused on the one hand specifically on financial institutions' activities, so investing, underwriting, lending, but also to try and align these activities with ocean health. And I think they can serve as a first step if financial institutions are interested to start thinking about these topics. Again, not every financial institution out there is thinking about the ocean necessarily yet. But things like establishing such a science policy interface, commission or whatever you want to call it, alongside with broad science-based criteria and standards is, I think, the way forward. We do have an opportunity here to learn from what has happened on climate, although it might have been too slow. We can learn from that and do it better on pollution, I think.
And there may be an opportunity also. Joel, I think, was mentioning the work that the Royal Society of Chemistry is doing, and indeed yourselves with them. That sounds like it's the kind of work that could feed into things like ESG guidance and guidelines. But can I come to you, Elsie? You had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on a few of the excellent points that Joel was making, specifically thinking about, when we think about addressing this problem, we have to think about functionality of materials and identifying that. And I work in an engineering department with many very talented chemists and material scientists. And right now we're undergoing a revolution in materials design. So we're going from this era of having all these static materials that have one functionality to things like our iPhones, which are smart materials. And that in itself requires innovation in chemistry and combining elements and materials that we have not done before. And if I can go back to one of Joel's even earlier points, we got in this mess in the first place when we failed to think about health, safety, and the environment when we went through that first industrial chemicals revolution. And so as an educator, I feel compelled to point out that one of the critical elements of addressing this problem is pedagogy. So we need to be thinking about education. I teach a class on toxicology this semester, and the students in my class actually said to me, why don't we talk about just basic principles of health, safety, and toxicology with these chemicals in high school? This is not part of our biology discussions or, our environmental science discussions. So there's a big opportunity there, even at the college level. There, in chemical engineering curriculum, typically there's no discussion of toxicology, environmental fate, and transport of chemicals. So I think this is one, paired with all of these other excellent ideas that everyone has been talking about, I think this is really essential. And when we think about raising awareness of this issue, just like some of these climate issues, you have to go all the way back to that next generation of leaders in our society and be talking about these issues. So thank you, Joel, for raising all those points.
I mean, to that point, Dennis, your thoughts?
Yeah, sorry, just very, very briefly jumping in. I do want to reiterate what Elsa just said. I think we need exactly the same thing on the side of financial institutions. We need to educate them about the risks that come with marine chemical pollution or chemical pollution in general. And we crucially need to link these risks to the impact their investments have on the environment, on society, but also where the risks are for their businesses, and also where their position can be a lever for positive impact. So, highlighting what is the risk of inaction from a financial institution standpoint. Will it have effects on your portfolio investment, on your underwriting business? Are there any risk dimensions that you haven't considered? And often, that might be the case. And to also, of course, on the positive side, highlight a first mover advantage. And of course, again, coming back to regulatory pressure, I think that will only increase going forward. So the earlier you move on that into a positive direction, the better for you as a business.
And Sophie.
Just to add on what you said about investors, Dennis, we have had a situation where 23 investors that have 4.4 billion USD under asset under management, that signed a letter to the chemical producers saying that they see it as a key risk is that they're producing hazardous chemicals for that sector. So the key risk in the entire chemical sector is the production of hazardous chemicals. I think that's a very interesting move that shows the direction that this could really become some potential interest for investors in the future. The link it to oceans would be great.
I absolutely agree. And Joel, I just want to come to you, but I would just to pick up on all of those points at one level, but the sense of needing to go back to basics and to sort of, in a way, inculcate green chemistry, if I might put it that way, into absolutely everything that we do and every discovery make. It doesn't necessarily work all the time, does it? In the sense that we are moving towards electrification of our economies, digitalization of our economies, and quite often what's happening through this process, and the European Union the European Environment Agency has mentioned this quite often, is that discoveries of new chemicals, of regrettable substitution and so on and so forth, is moving so fast that some of these chemicals that have been used in the fourth industrial revolution are coming out, and they're probably and could be just as harmful as anything that was used before. So somehow coming back to basics is going to be really important. And Joel, that's to your point, indeed, of green chemistry. Is green chemistry, it's very, very nascent, isn't it? It needs to be accelerated.
Right. I would say it's more than nascent. It just needs to take off and be accelerated. I think going back to Elsie's point is we need to train a generation of chemists, engineers, and health scientists that can work together to understand the health, safety, environmental aspects at the design phase. I even think of more recent technologies like nanotechnologies, right, where we knew that there was a potential problem, and we put only a small fraction of the dollars we should have into understanding the health safety implications, and the cat's out of the bag, where we're not even really regulating nanomaterials the way we should. So we do need to avoid jumping from the frying pan into the fire, right? So that means we really need to be careful as we design the next materials. And it's not just about the health, safety, environmental impacts. It could be about the community impacts. For example, in the United States, we have, where we manufacture chemicals and materials matters. It often is in poor and minority communities. They already have a cumulative burden of the production that has been there. So we need to really rethink as well our production systems. Maybe we need to think about more distributed, flexible, variable production systems that don't allocate all of the impact in a single region or a single place. But that's, where, as one of my mentors said, we put people on the moon. If we can figure out how to put people on the moon, we can make materials and products that don't harm ourselves and the planet. Right? But that takes really a concerted, organized effort to do it. And we still have significant silos in education, significant silos in government agencies, significant silos even in industry that need to be broken down to really look at this in a much more thoughtful way.
So if you were to think of an industry wish list, Joel, as to how to sort of move forward innovation, in particular around green chemistry, what would it be?
Well, I think you need to bring together the whole value chain, for one, understand what the functional needs are, what the product needs are. You bring together, we're doing this in the Green Chemistry and Commerce Council, is build these relationships between retailers, brands, formulators, and chemical suppliers so that they can understand their needs. They can understand the challenges they have. We've met with a number of chief technology officers of mid-sized chemical companies that are ready to make the more sustainable chemicals and materials of the future, but no one's willing to pay for them. So we need to also understand that the future, because those external costs are not incorporated into the costs of our products, that means that new innovative chemicals, unless they have some significant functionality benefit, are likely to be more expensive because capitalization, investment, commercialization costs money. So we've got to be willing to accept that the products of the future may cost more. And then we have to deal with the distributive impacts of that to primarily poor people, right? So there are a lot of economic issues that need to come into play in this. But I think it is that value chain collaboration, understand functional needs and then solutions, and then link that up with, most of our innovation is not going to come from the chemical industry. It's going to come from small, innovative startups, and they're going to need the connections to the larger strategics to then bring their innovations into the value chain and to scale.
I just want to pick up on that point of collaboration, if I may, and just sort of end off our discussion today just on this question of how to build a more effective and successful engagement across all of the stakeholders. And I know, if I could start with you, Anne-Sophie, one of the focus areas that you have is looking at the way in which companies that use chemical products can be engaged with, and I think that's a highly successful way of getting those companies in turn to potentially pressure the chemicals producers to make changes. What do you think are the kind of key sort of guideposts for sort of successful engagement?
First of all, there's interest among the companies that they realize that this is something they have to work on. It's not just something that should be dealt with down there on the sustainability department. It's a question really for a company on the highest level. I think that's an awareness that needs to be made. And what we do quite often, we have a business group with a lot of different companies from different sectors that meet and discuss problems. And why they want to be there is because they've said we are sitting with the same problem, no matter which sector we are in. But we have a completely different solution depending on which sector we are in. So therefore, they want to share the information and learn from the other ones how to tackle certain problems. because they have the same problem, but very different ways of solutions. So this kind of collaborations, transparency, that you are allowed also, and you dare to share information, is key for success. And I think actually internally within a company, it's very important to decide that actually the designers are never allowed to go ahead if the chemical team has not said yes. So they need to be above in the structure than where the designers are. And that's the case, not very rare companies today have that situation. But that's the way how you build a sustainable company, I would say, in the long run.
Thank you. Dennis, your thoughts? I mean, you haven't engaged the chemicals community quite yet, but you have engaged the plastics community. And there must be some interesting lessons there, briefly, if you can, on drawing first movers into that.
Certainly, yes. I think collaboration across silos, and that means beyond finance, with scientists, with policymakers, with the conservation NGO community, has been really key to our approach at UNEP FI. So just very briefly, we do convene a community of practice on the sustainable blue economy in more general terms. But as a practical output here, we do actually have guidance across different sectors that are ocean linked, like seafood and ports and shipping, that all have this thread of marine chemical pollution run through them. And we also now have guidance on plastics and solids waste. So we really try to be very practical there and give recommendations of actions that financial institutions can take right now to improve the situation by saying, here are some examples of activities that are no-goes, that are red flags that you should not finance. And at the other end of the spectrum, also saying, here is what best practice looks like on certain topics like pollution across these sectors. And this is what you should request from companies that you deal with, your clients, your investees, in terms of data, in terms of background information. This is what you should look for when you engage and when you invest. So just want to make sure that when you work with these stakeholders, it's always good to educate first, but then also provide practical steps that any stakeholder can take relatively swiftly to move the needle.
Joel, if I could come to you finally, I mean, and then briefly to Elsie, your coalition of the willing. You're always trying to build that coalition of the willing, of those you're advocating, bringing together new companies and others into the space, bringing particularly progressive ones. How are you doing that?
Yeah, it's really pressure from multiple ends, right? Why are companies coming into networks like the GC3? Because they do want to see a path forward. They want to work together. They want to understand their value chain. Collaboration, and I've seen this much more over the last 5 years. Companies want to work together, as Anne-Sophie said, to solve challenges, to share their lessons, in a pre-competitive space. But that collaboration then has to extend to academics, to government, to build a much bigger network, to the finance community, because the finance community also needs to understand the investment horizons, the challenges of capitalization, right? I mean, even today, the finance community continues to finance ethylene and plastics production, as the Montreal Foundation has shown, while saying we want to reduce our risk of chemicals. So you can't have it both ways, right? We're seeing this, we need to all go in a similar direction and understand the challenges, right? There are huge challenges ahead, but together we can, if we collaborate, we can find solutions. And I think that's the basic message that we need to sort of follow is that collaborative message, and understand there has to be pressure as well, right? We're not going to, if these chemicals are highly capitalized, cost effective, well integrated, if there's no pressure to change the system, it's not going to change. And I think lastly, that those first movers, right? There's the famous Everett Rogers curve of diffusion, right? We need to get that the early adopters to the early majority, and hopefully that tips the scales and we start moving, towards the right direction, and the laggards will just ultimately have to go.
And Elsie, does that apply to the science community? Trying to get the first movers engaged?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've heard is we need transparency, we need awareness, we need collaboration, and then among the scientific community, we need systems thinkers. So we need to cross these silos and these disciplinary barriers to design these effective solutions that are, really a broad societal problem. So it's been really nice to hear all these ideas this morning.
Indeed it has, and I just want to give my warm thanks to all our distinguished panelists, all of whom have at one point or another contributed to the thinking of the report, The Invisible Wave, which is available now on our website, backtoblueinitiative.com. And I do hope you will take the time to visit that website and read the report. And as we say in the report, and as I said earlier, failing to act now, as we've had throughout this conversation, I think failing to act now is a risk too far. We need to begin action quickly and not wait. We hope you find the report useful and stimulating, and thank you for listening.